Close your eyes, let your breath slow. Let the warmth of the room settle around you like something earned, like something that was not always guaranteed. Because tonight, we are going to imagine it taken away, slowly, quietly, without drama, the way the most profound changes always happen, not in a single catastrophic moment, but in the slow accumulation of cold, degree by degree, year by year, millennium by millennium. Tonight, we are going to imagine that the ice never left. The last great ice age, the one that shaped the world you were born into, the one that carved the valleys and deposited the hills and drew the coastlines and drove the migrations that brought your ancestors to wherever they were. When the warming finally came, that ice age ended approximately 11,700 years ago. Not in a single day, not with a dramatic thaw. It ended the way it had begun. Slowly, over thousands of years, the ice retreating northward and upward, the sea level rising, the forests advancing across what had been tundra, the rivers filling with meltwater, the soil warming, the seeds germinating in ground that had not been touched by green in 20,000 years. That ending was not inevitable. It was the result of a particular configuration of variables of the Earth's orbital geometry, of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, of the distribution of ocean currents, of feedback loops that happened to tip in the direction of warming rather than further cooling. Had those variables been slightly different, the warming might not have come. The ice might have stayed. The world we know, our cities, our agriculture, our civilizations, our entire human story, as it has unfolded over the last 10 millennia, might not have been possible. What would the world look like tonight if the ice had never retreated? If the glaciers that covered Canada and Scandinavia and northern Russia and the high mountains of every continent had simply remained growing, perhaps, or holding steady, or retreating only slightly before advancing again for the last 12,000 years. That is what we are going to explore tonight. Not a catastrophe in the usual sense, not a meteor impact or a volcanic eruption or a sudden freeze, just the world as it almost was, the world of the permanent ice age, the world that was one orbital wobble away from being the only world any human being had ever known. So let the warmth of the room hold you. Let the weight of the blankets remind you of everything the ice did not take. And let us begin what the Ice Age actually was. Before we can imagine the Ice Age never ending, we need to understand what it actually was. Because the Ice Age, the last glacial maximum, which peaked around 20,000 years ago, was not the frozen apocalypse that the phrase might suggest. It was not a world of uniform white, a planet encased in ice from pole to pole. It was more subtle than that, and in some ways more interesting. The Earth has been in what geologists call an ice age for approximately 2.6 million years. This entire stretch of time, the Quaternary Ice Age, is characterized by the presence of permanent ice sheets at the poles. By that definition, we are still in an ice age right now. The Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet are the surviving remnants of a glacial world, and they have been present in one form or another for millions of years. What changes within an ice age are the glacial and interglacial cycles. During a glacial period, what most people mean when they say the Ice Age, the ice sheets expand, covering vast areas of the northern hemisphere. During an interglacial period, which is where we are now, in the Holocene, the ice sheets retreat, the climate warms, and the world more closely resembles what we know today. These cycles are driven primarily by changes in the Earth's orbit around the Sun, variations in the tilt of the Earth's axis, and changes in the Earth's rotational wobble, collectively known as Milankovic cycles, after the Serbian mathematician Milutin Milankovic, who first calculated them in the early 20th century. The last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent glacial period, occurred about 20,000 years ago. At that time, ice sheets covered approximately 30% of the Earth's land surface. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet extended from the Arctic south to approximately the latitude of present-day New York City, covering all of Canada and the northern United States. In Europe, the Fennoscandian ice sheet covered Scandinavia, much of Britain, northern Germany, Poland, and extended eastward across much of Russia. In Asia, the Siberian ice sheet was smaller but significant. The Tibetan Plateau was covered in glaciers. The Andes were heavily glaciated. Even the mountains of East Africa bore glaciers that extended far below their current limits. At the height of the glacial maximum, sea level was approximately 120 meters lower than today. 120 meters. That is not a small difference. The coastlines of the world were dramatically different. The shallow continental shelves, the areas of ocean that are today less than 120 meters deep, were dry land. The North Sea was dry. The English Channel was a river valley. The Bering Land Bridge, the land connection between Asia and North America, was exposed, and animals and humans were crossing it. The islands of Southeast Asia were connected to the Asian mainland in a vast landmass called Sundaland. Australia and New Guinea were joined in a single continent called Sahul. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. The Mediterranean was significantly smaller. The world map was different in ways that would be immediately obvious to any modern observer. The climate of the glacial maximum was cold, obviously, but it was also drier than today. The vast ice sheets were essentially giant deserts. They produced no precipitation, absorbed any moisture that fell on them, and their cold, dry air flowed outward over the surrounding landscape, desiccating it. The regions immediately south of the ice sheets were not forested. They were cold steppes and tundra, treeless grasslands swept by bitter winds, inhabited by the megafauna of the Pleistocene, the woolly mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses and cave bears and steppe bison and giant horses that we know from cave paintings and permafrost specimens. Further south, in the tropics, the effects of the glacial maximum were complex. The tropics did not freeze. They were much too warm for that, but they were drier. The Amazon rainforest shrank to a fraction of its current size, surviving in fragmented refugia, while the rest of the basin was savanna and dry woodland. The Sahara was larger than today, or perhaps differently arranged, with some regions wetter and some drier. The monsoon systems were weaker. The intertropical convergence zone, which brings seasonal rainfall to the tropics, was displaced and altered. This was the world that existed 20,000 years ago. Cold, dry, large in its exposed land area, dominated in the north by ice, in the mid-latitudes by tundra and steppe, in the tropics by drier and more variable conditions than today, inhabited by megafauna and by small bands of human beings who were, by all evidence, remarkably skilled at surviving in conditions that would kill most modern people in days. And then the warming began. The orbital cycles shifted. The northern hemisphere began receiving slightly more summer sunlight. The ice began to melt at its edges. The meltwater flowed into the ocean, slightly altering its circulation. The altered circulation changed the distribution of heat. More heat meant more melting. More melting meant more ocean, which absorbed more heat. The positive feedback loops of deglaciation built on each other, And over the course of several thousand years, with some abrupt reversals and pauses along the way, the great ice sheets retreated to where they are today. But what if they hadn't? The ice sheets that would have stayed. Imagine the moment of decision, not a moment, really, but a century, a millennium, a slow window of geological time during which the Milankovitch forcing was sufficient to begin a warming, but not sufficient to complete it. Imagine that the northern hemisphere summer insolation increased slightly, enough to melt the southernmost edges of the ice sheets, but that the feedback loops did not fully engage. The ice retreated from New York, but not from Pennsylvania. It retreated from London, but not from Edinburgh. It retreated from the Baltic coast, but not from Scandinavia proper. And then the orbital geometry shifted back. The insolation decreased. The ice began to advance again. The brief, interglacial, barely a few thousand years, warm enough to grow some forest on the exposed land at the margin of the ice, warm enough for some species to expand northward, but not warm enough to establish the stable, permanent forests of the modern world ended. The ice came back. This scenario is not fantastical. It has happened before. The Quaternary Ice Age has seen dozens of glacial cycles, and not all of them produced interglacials as warm and as long as the Holocene. Some interglacials were brief, only a few thousand years of relative warmth before the ice returned. The Holocene, at nearly 12,000 years of warmth and stability, is unusual. We may have been lucky. If the ice had never fully retreated, the Laurentide ice sheet would today cover all of Canada and the northernmost United States, not thinned and retreated as it was at the glacial maximum, but as it would be after another 12,000 years of uninterrupted cold, perhaps thicker, perhaps somewhat different in its precise extent, but present and formidable. The ice would be kilometers thick over Hudson Bay, over Quebec, over Ontario, over Baffin Island and Ellesmere Island, and the entire archipelago of the Canadian Arctic. The Fennoscandian ice sheet would cover Scandinavia, Finland, and the Baltic states. Iceland would be largely buried under ice. Britain would be substantially glaciated, perhaps entirely so, during the coldest phases. Northern Germany and Poland and the Baltic coast of Russia would be under ice, or under the periglacial conditions, the cold, treeless, wind-blasted tundra that characterized the landscape just south of the ice margin during the last glacial maximum. In Asia, the Siberian ice would be more extensive. The mountains of Central Asia, the Himalayas, the Pamir, the Tian Shan, the Altai, would be more heavily glaciated, their ice fields extending further down the valleys, their meltwater rivers running cold and gray with glacial flour into the lowland rivers. The Tibetan Plateau would be almost entirely glaciated. In the southern hemisphere, the Antarctic ice sheet, already vast, would be somewhat larger, extending further onto the continental shelf. The glaciers of Patagonia and the southern Andes would be far more extensive. New Zealand would be more heavily glaciated. The high mountains of every continent, the Rockies, the Alps, the Caucasus, the Andes, the East African highlands, the mountains of New Guinea would all bear larger, more persistent glaciers than they do today. And the sea level, the sea level. If the Holocene warming had never come, the sea level would be approximately where it was at the last glacial maximum, roughly 120 meters below its current position. In some scenarios, if the ice had continued to grow rather than simply holding steady, it might be even lower. The continental shelves would be dry land. The world map would be drawn in lines that no modern atlas has ever shown. A different Atlantic, a different Pacific, stand on what is today the eastern coast of the United States, somewhere around the latitude of Cape Hatteras. You would be looking out over the Atlantic Ocean, deep water visible from the shore, the horizon, a clean line between sea and sky. In the world of the permanent ice age, you would be looking out over land, dry land, extending perhaps 100 kilometers or more to the east before the ocean began the continental shelf, exposed by the lower sea level, a broad coastal plain of sand and gravel and shallow lakes and river channels carved by the rivers draining southward off the ice. This coastal plain would not be empty. It would be inhabited. In fact, it would be one of the more productive environments in the permanent ice age world, because it would sit in the transition zone between the cold steppes and tundra of the interior and the slightly warmer conditions near the open ocean. There would be grasses and sedges. There would be cold-adapted shrubs, willows, and dwarf birches, prostrate and wind-stunted but present. And there would be animals, herds of horses and bison and musk oxen grazing on the coastal plain, hunted by wolves and lions, and the human bands that moved with them. The North Sea would be dry land. The English Channel today, a busy shipping lane separating Britain from France, would not exist. Britain would be part of mainland Europe, connected by the broad valley of what is today the submerged Doggerland, a low-lying plain through which rivers drained northward from the European ice sheet. This landscape would be cold and treeless, a tundra of mosses and sedges and dwarf willows, swept by the winds coming off the Fennoscandian ice to the north. It would be inhabited by reindeer and woolly mammoths and the human bands who followed them. The Mediterranean would be smaller. The shallow shelves at the western entrance, the area around the Strait of Gibraltar, would be exposed, and the strait itself would be narrower and shallower, with a stronger flow of Atlantic water into the basin. The Adriatic would be largely dry land. The Aegean would be substantially reduced, with many of today's island chains connected to the mainland. The Black Sea, cut off from the Mediterranean by the lower sea level, would be a freshwater lake, fed by the rivers draining off the Caucasus and the Eastern European plains. The Persian Gulf would not exist. It would be a river valley, a broad, flat plain through which a great river drained southward into what is now the northern Indian Ocean. This river, which some researchers have called the Gulf River, would carry the combined drainage of the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the rivers draining off the Iranian plateau. The valley would be habitable warmer than the northern steppes, sheltered from the worst of the glacial winds, watered by the river. In the permanent Ice Age world, it might be one of the relatively hospitable environments of the Middle East. The Bering Land Bridge would be permanent. In the actual glacial maximum, it was exposed, connecting Asia to North America. In the world of the permanent Ice Age, it would have been exposed continuously for the entire 12,000 years of what would have been our Holocene. Not just a seasonal or millennial connection, but a permanent land, crossing a broad plain, perhaps 1,000 kilometers wide, connecting the two continents along the Arctic coast. Animals would move freely across it. Humans would have crossed it many times, in both directions, not just the once or twice that current evidence suggests for our own history. The Pacific would be larger, in the sense that its coastlines would be different. The exposed continental shelves would add land rather than remove it from the coastal zones. Southeast Asia would be dramatically different. The shallow Sunda Shelf today, covered by the South China Sea and the Java Sea, would be dry land, connecting the islands of Borneo, Sumatra, and Java to the Asian mainland in the vast peninsula of Sundaland. This peninsula would extend hundreds of kilometers further south than the modern coastline. It would have rivers and lakes and forests, slightly warmer than the northern steppes. but drier than the modern tropical rainforests of the region. Australia would be connected to New Guinea. The combined continent of Sahul would be larger than either country is today. Its northern coast extending further toward the equator, its southern coast pushing further toward Antarctica. The interior of Sahul would be drier than the modern Australian interior, which is already extremely dry, with vast salt flats and sand deserts, where today there are only smaller versions of the same. This is the geography of the permanent ice age, a world with more land and less ocean, with different continents and different coastlines, with new connections and new barriers, a world that human beings had, they existed in the permanent ice age, would have had to navigate on entirely different terms. The forests that would never have grown. The forests of the modern world are, in a very real sense, children of the Holocene warming. They would not exist without it, and in the permanent ice age, they would not exist at all, or rather, they would exist only in small, fragmented refugia in the warmer south and along the coasts where the ocean moderated the temperature. The boreal forest, the taiga, which today stretches across Canada and Russia in the largest forest biome on Earth, would not exist in the permanent ice age world. The land it currently covers would be under ice or under periglacial tundra, so cold and so wind-scoured that trees cannot survive. The spruce and pine and fir trees that define the boreal forest need soil, and soil requires the long, patient decomposition of organic matter that cannot happen when the ground is frozen to depths of hundreds of meters. They need a growing season of at least a few weeks, and in the shadow of the permanent ice sheets, the growing seasons would be too short, too cold, too dark for trees to establish. The temperate deciduous forests of Europe and eastern North America, the forests of oak and maple and beech and elm that define our idea of a forest, that feature in our fairy tales and our literature, and our sense of what a forest should be, would also be absent. These forests exist in the Holocene because of the relatively mild, relatively moist climate that the retreat of the ice sheets enabled. In the permanent ice age, the areas they currently occupy would be cold steppes, or tundra, or periglacial desert. The soils would be thin and frozen. The winters would be too long and too cold. The summers would be too short and too dry. Even the tropical rainforests, which we tend to think of as eternal, as ancient beyond reckoning, as the default state of the tropics, would be dramatically reduced. During the last glacial maximum, the Amazon rainforest shrank to perhaps 30% of its current extent. The rest of the Amazon basin was savanna and dry woodland, interrupted by forest only along the river channels, where moisture was available year-round. In the permanent ice age, this reduced, fragmented Amazon would be the norm. The vast, continuous canopy of the modern Amazon, with its extraordinary biodiversity, its billions of trees, its role as a carbon sink and a rainfall engine for the entire South American continent, would not exist. In its place would be a mosaic of forest patches along rivers, separated by vast dry grasslands. The same would be true of the Congo rainforest in Africa, the forests of Southeast Asia, the wet forests of Central America. All would be reduced, fragmented, pushed toward the coasts and the river valleys where moisture was available. The world's forests would be smaller, simpler, less connected, and less diverse than they are today. In place of the forests, the dominant vegetation of the permanent ice age world would be steppe and tundra. The mammoth steppe, the vast, cold grassland that stretched from Western Europe to Eastern Asia during the last glacial maximum, dominated by grasses and sedges and herbs, grazed by mammoths and horses and bison and woolly rhinoceroses, would cover enormous areas of the northern landmass. This steppe would not be the green, lush grassland of the modern imagination. It would be cold, dry, and wind-blasted, the grasses short and tough, the ground frozen beneath a thin, active layer that thawed briefly in summer. But it would be productive, in its way productive enough to support the enormous herds of megafauna that characterized the Pleistocene. The shrublands and semi-deserts of the world would be expanded. The Sahara today, the largest hot desert in the world, was actually more variable during the glacial maximum than it is today, with some periods wetter and some drier. In the permanent ice age, the Sahara's extent and character would depend on the precise state of the climate, but the absence of the strong African monsoon that currently brings seasonal rainfall to the Sahel would tend to make it larger, drier, more inhospitable. The Arabian Peninsula would be an arid wasteland, largely empty of vegetation except along the coasts. Central Asia, already dry in the modern world, with the Gobi Desert and the Central Asian steppes, would be even drier because the ice sheets to the north would block the moisture-bearing winds that currently bring precipitation to the region. The great grasslands of the Mongolian steppe would be cold, dry, and wind-scoured, even colder than they are today. The Tibetan Plateau, largely glaciated, would be a frozen desert above the surrounding lowlands. The world of the permanent ice age would be a world of grass and tundra and ice, with forests surviving only in the warmest and moistest refugia along the coasts of the warmer oceans, in the tropical river valleys, in the scattered refugia of the tropics. It would be a simpler world, botanically, than the one we know, but it would not be dead. Far from it. The animals of the eternal ice, the animals of the permanent ice age, would be, in many respects, the animals we know from the Pleistocene fossils, the great megafauna of the ice age world, the giants that have captivated human imagination since we first found their bones and carved their images in caves. But they would not be the same animals, frozen in time. They would have continued to evolve for 12,000 more years in a world that remained cold. The woolly mammoth, that most iconic of Ice Age animals, would still walk the earth in the world of the permanent Ice Age. In our world, the woolly mammoth went extinct approximately 10,000 years ago on the mainland, with the last isolated population surviving on Wrangel Island in the Arctic until about 4,000 years ago. The primary causes of extinction were almost certainly the combined effects of the warming climate which destroyed the mammoth steppe, replacing it with the boreal forest and tundra that mammoths could not efficiently exploit, and human hunting, which finished off populations that were already stressed by habitat loss. In the permanent ice age, neither of these factors would have operated. The mammoth steppe would have remained intact, or even expanded in some areas, as the ice sheets maintained the cold, dry conditions that supported it. Human populations, without the agricultural revolution that the Holocene warming made possible, would have remained small and scattered, their hunting pressure significant on a local scale, but not sufficient to drive extinction across the entire range of a species that numbered in the millions. The woolly mammoth of the permanent Ice Age world would be 12,000 years more evolved than the mammoths we know from fossils. 12,000 years is not a long time in geological terms, but it is enough for meaningful evolutionary change, especially in a species under strong selective pressure. The mammoths might be slightly different in size, slightly different in their coat color or thickness, slightly different in their tusk shape. They might have developed behavioral adaptations to conditions that became more extreme or less extreme, depending on the trajectory of the climate. But they would be recognizable. They would be mammoths, walking across the frozen plains of the permanent ice age, their great curved tusks sweeping the snow aside to reach the vegetation beneath. The woolly rhinoceros would also survive. Like the mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros went extinct at the end of the Pleistocene, the victim of the same combination of climate change and human hunting that destroyed so much of the Ice Age megafauna. In the permanent Ice Age, the woolly rhinoceros would still browse the cold steppes of Eurasia, its thick fur coat insulating it against the bitter winds. Its flattened horn evolved for sweeping snow, clearing the way to the frozen grass beneath. The cave lion, a subspecies or closely related species of lion, larger than the modern African lion, adapted to the cold steppes of Pleistocene Eurasia, would still hunt the mammoth steppe. It was the apex predator of the Ice Age grasslands, and it would have remained so in a world where those grasslands persisted. In our world, the cave lion vanished approximately 12,000 years ago as the steppes it depended on disappeared. In the permanent Ice Age, it would still be present, perhaps somewhat changed by 12,000 more years of evolution in a continuously cold world, perhaps ranging further or less far than its Pleistocene ancestors, but present. The dire wolf, the large, robust wolf of Pleistocene North America, would still hunt the coastal plains and cold steppes of the New World. In our world, it went extinct around the same time as the mammoths and the other North American megafauna, the victim of ecosystem collapse as the climate warmed and the megaherbivores it preyed upon disappeared. In the permanent Ice Age, the dire wolf would still be present, hunting in packs across the exposed continental shelves and the cold grasslands south of the Laurentide ice. The giant ground sloths, those extraordinary animals, as large as modern elephants, that browsed the grasslands and woodlands of Pleistocene North and South America, would still be present. They moved slowly, but they were enormously strong, and they could reach vegetation that other animals could not. In the permanent Ice Age, they would be grazing on the cold steppes and tundra edges, their massive claws digging up roots and tubers from the frozen soil, their thick coats protecting them from the wind. The short-faced bear, the largest bear in the history of North America, with long legs built for running and a shortened face packed with powerful crushing teeth, would still roam the continent. It was an apex predator and scavenger of the Pleistocene, capable of running down prey and of stealing kills from other predators. In the permanent Ice Age, it would still occupy this role, competing with the dire wolf and the cave lion for the carcasses of mammoths and horses and bison. The Irish elk, the largest deer that has ever lived, with antlers spanning up to 3.7 meters, would still stand on the frozen plains of Eurasia, its magnificent antlers raised against the ice-gray sky. In our world, it went extinct approximately 7,700 years ago, the last population struggling in isolated refugia as the forests advanced and the open grasslands it needed for its antlers, which would have been lethal, encumbrances in dense woodland disappeared. In the permanent Ice Age, the open grasslands would never disappear, and the Irish elk would still be part of them. The American mastodon, the Colombian mammoth, the American horse, the American camel, the sabre-toothed cat Smilodon, all of the great megafauna of the American Pleistocene, all gone from our world within a few thousand years of the arrival of humans and the onset of the Holocene warming. would persist in the permanent ice age. North America would be a continent of giants, its plains and valleys inhabited by an assemblage of large mammals that would make the modern African savanna look impoverished by comparison. In the oceans, the permanent ice age would also mean the persistence of populations of marine mammals that have diminished or changed in our world. The cold, productive waters of the glacial oceans, rich in nutrients upwelled from the deep, would support enormous populations of whales, seals, walruses, and the seabirds that feed on the same fish and krill. The great auk, the flightless North Atlantic seabird that went extinct in 1844 due to human hunting, would never have been hunted to extinction in a world where human populations remained small and scattered. The Steller's sea cow, the enormous kelp-grazing marine mammal that went extinct in 1768, only 27 years after its discovery by Europeans, would still graze the cold kelp forests of the North Pacific. The world of the permanent ice age would be a world of living giants, of megafauna that our world has lost. It would be, in some ways, a richer world in terms of the sheer biomass of large animals than the world we know today. The steppes and tundras would be grazed by herds of mammoths and horses and bison. The forests of the refugia would be browsed by giant ground sloths and mastodons. The rivers and coasts would be thick with seals and walruses, and the giant salmon and trout of cold, clear, glacially fed waters. The humans who would have stayed small. In the world of the permanent ice age, there would be humans. We know this because humans existed during the last glacial maximum, some 20,000 years ago, and they were surviving and thriving in conditions that were, in some ways, as harsh as what we are imagining. Human beings, in small bands of perhaps 20 to 50 individuals, were living across the Ice Age world in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas, in Africa, hunting the megafauna, gathering plant foods where available, sheltering in caves and skin-covered structures, making tools from stone and bone, creating art and music and ceremony. In the permanent Ice Age, these humans would still be present, but they would be different, not in their biology. The fundamental biology of our species, Homo sapiens, was established well before the last glacial maximum, and 12,000 more years of cold would not significantly alter our basic physical form, but in their culture, in their numbers, in their relationship to the world around them. The agricultural revolution, the transition from foraging to farming that transformed human civilization, would never happen in the permanent Ice Age. Agriculture requires certain things: a stable, warm climate that allows predictable growing seasons, the presence of wild grass species that can be domesticated into grain crops, the concentration of human populations in areas where resources are abundant and year-round habitation is possible, and a degree of environmental predictability that allows the long-term planning that farming requires. None of these conditions would exist in the permanent Ice Age. The wild ancestors of wheat and barley, the grasses of the Fertile Crescent that became, in our world, the foundation of Middle Eastern agriculture, would not exist in the permanent Ice Age in the form they took in the early Holocene. The warm, moist conditions of the early Holocene allowed these wild grasses to spread and to become productive enough to be worth cultivating. In the cold, dry conditions of the permanent Ice Age, they would either not exist at all or would be reduced to small, scattered populations in the warmer refugia. The wild ancestors of rice, of maize, of millet, of sorghum, all the grain crops that became the foundation of the world's major agricultural civilizations would similarly be absent or reduced in the permanent Ice Age. Without these foundational crops, agriculture as we know it would not be possible. And without agriculture, the human population would remain small. Foraging societies typically support one person per several square kilometers of good territory. The permanent Ice Age world, with its vast expanses of cold tundra and steppe, would support far fewer people per unit area than the temperate and tropical agricultural lands of the Holocene world. The total human population of the permanent Ice Age world, at the point where our Holocene would have been 12,000 years in, would probably be in the range of a few million, perhaps 5 to 10 million people at most, compared to the 8 billion who inhabit the Earth today. These people would be distributed across all the habitable continents in small bands, living as hunter-gatherers with sophisticated knowledge of their local environments. They would be extraordinarily skilled hunters. 12,000 more years of hunting the Ice Age megafauna would produce cultures of consummate skill, cultures that knew the migration routes of the mammoths and the reindeer and the horses better than any modern ornithologist, knows the migration routes of birds, that could read the wind and the snow and the behavior of animals with a depth of knowledge that no modern person can fully imagine, that made tools of exquisite refinement from the bones and tusks and hides of the animals they hunted. They would also be culturally extraordinary. The artistic traditions of the Paleolithic, the cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira, the carved figurines, the musical instruments, the ritual burials were already sophisticated at the time of the last glacial maximum. 12,000 more years of cultural development, even without agriculture, would produce cultures of remarkable complexity and richness, not civilizations in the sense of cities and writing and states. Those require agriculture and the population density it enables, but complex societies with elaborate oral traditions, with sophisticated cosmologies, with rich ceremonial lives. The humans of the permanent Ice Age would know the stars with an intimacy that most modern people cannot approach, because navigating by the stars was essential for moving across featureless snowfields and tundra. They would know the behavior of animals with a depth that no modern biologist has achieved, because that knowledge was the difference between eating and starving. They would know the medicinal properties of every plant in their environment, because that knowledge was the difference between surviving an injury or illness and dying from it. They would be small in number, widely distributed, culturally rich, and materially simple. They would have no cities, no writing, no metal tools. The smelting of metal requires not just the discovery of the technique, but the environmental context that makes it useful, which includes the settled life and the complex trade networks that agriculture enables. They would have stone tools, bone tools, and tools made from the natural materials available in their environment. They would have language and art and ceremony, and they would have survived. The groups that lived in the warmer refugia along the coasts of the warmer oceans, in the valleys of the major tropical rivers, in the slightly warmer and moister environments of the subtropics, would be the most populous and the most culturally complex. These would be the equivalent of the coastal peoples of the Northwest Pacific or the river valley peoples of Central Africa in our own world, people who could rely on the productivity of fish and shellfish and the abundant plant foods of warmer, wetter environments to support slightly higher population densities and slightly more settled ways of life. The groups that lived on the cold steppes and tundras of the north would be more nomadic, more widely ranging, following the migrations of the megafauna herds across vast landscapes. They would be the inheritors of 12,000 years of additional development of the technologies that Ice Age peoples actually used: better cold weather clothing, better shelter construction, better ways of preserving and storing food through the long, dark winters, better tools for hunting animals that were themselves 12,000 years more evolved and possibly more wary of human hunters. There would be no Roman Empire in the permanent Ice Age, no ancient Egypt, no Mesopotamia, no China, no India, none of the great riverine civilizations that arose in the early Holocene as the warming climate made agriculture possible and human populations grew beyond the capacity of foraging to support. There would be no cities, no writing, no mathematics, no recorded history, but there would be people, wise, skilled, deeply connected to their world, and thoroughly human. The coastlines of a frozen world, the coastlines of the permanent Ice Age world, would be among the most strange and unfamiliar features of that alternative geography. With sea level 120 meters lower than today, the world's coastlines would be redrawn in ways that would make an ordinary modern map unrecognizable. Britain would not be an island. The landmass of Doggerland, today submerged beneath the shallow North Sea, would extend from the British Isles eastward to connect with the coast of the Netherlands and Germany. This exposed land would be one of the most productive environments of the permanent Ice Age northern world, low-lying, with rivers draining off the surrounding hills, with access to the rich coastal fisheries of the northern Atlantic, with vegetation ranging from tundra in the north to cold steppe in the south. It would be inhabited. The humans living in the permanent Ice Age would almost certainly have significant populations along the Doggerland coast, exploiting the rich marine resources and the herds of reindeer and horses grazing the steppe. The Irish Sea would be dry. Ireland would be connected to Britain by a broad lowland plain. The Faroe Islands, today isolated in the North Atlantic, would be high ground in a broader landscape, perhaps connected to the Shetland Islands and to Scandinavia by exposed shelf, perhaps not, depending on the precise configuration of the sea level and the topography of the intervening seabed. The Mediterranean coastlines would be different in detail everywhere. The Adriatic Sea today, a relatively shallow embayment of the Mediterranean, would be largely dry land, a broad plain extending south from the Alps, through which the Po River would drain southward toward the Mediterranean proper. The Aegean today, dotted with islands, would be reduced, with the island chains of the Dodecanese and the Cyclades standing as hills above a drier plain, connected to the Greek and Turkish mainlands. In the eastern Mediterranean, the connection between the Levantine coast and the island of Cyprus, today separated by deep water, would be across a broad, shallow shelf. The Nile Delta, already enormous by modern standards, would extend far further into the Mediterranean, with the lower Nile flowing across a broad coastal plain before reaching the sea. The northern coast of Africa would be considerably further north into the Mediterranean basin. The Indian Ocean coastlines would be transformed. The Persian Gulf, as noted, would not exist. The Gulf of Oman would be reduced. The Strait of Hormuz would be partly dry. The broad continental shelf of the northwestern Indian Ocean today, relatively shallow, would be exposed, extending the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian subcontinent southward into what is today open ocean. The Bay of Bengal would be smaller. The great river deltas, the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta, the Irrawaddy Delta, the Mekong Delta, would extend much further southward across the exposed shelves, The Gulf of Tonkin would be largely dry. The South China Sea would be dramatically reduced, with the Sunda Shelf, the shallow basin between mainland Asia, Borneo, and Java, exposed as the peninsula of Sundaland. In the Americas, the Gulf of Mexico would be somewhat smaller, with the continental shelves exposed around its rim. The Caribbean islands would be larger and more connected. The coast of the Gulf of Mexico, along Texas and Louisiana today, a gentle, low-lying coast with extensive shallow bays and barrier islands, would be further south, with the Mississippi River flowing across a broad, exposed plain before reaching the sea. The coasts of the Americas along the Pacific would be different in detail, but less dramatically so, because the Pacific coast tends to be steeper and deeper than the Atlantic coast. But even there, the exposed continental shelves would add significant land area along the coast of California, along the coast of Ecuador and Peru, along the coast of Chile. These coastlines of the permanent Ice Age world would not be empty. They would be among the most productive and most inhabited environments of that world. Coastlines concentrate resources: fish, shellfish, seabirds, marine mammals, coastal vegetation in ways that the open steppe and tundra cannot. The Ice Age humans who lived along these coasts would have access to protein-rich diets that could support relatively high population densities, and the varied environments of the coastal zones, where the cold sea meets the cold land, would provide a wider range of resources than either environment alone. What the oceans would have become. The oceans of the permanent Ice Age would be different in chemistry, in circulation, in temperature, and in the life they supported. The most fundamental difference would be temperature. The glacial ocean was colder than the modern ocean, not everywhere, but on average. The North Atlantic and the North Pacific, in particular, would be significantly colder than they are today, because the cold air flowing off the ice sheets would chill the surface water to temperatures well below what we are accustomed to. The tropical oceans would also be somewhat cooler, perhaps 2 to 3 degrees Celsius below modern temperatures, because the cooler surface of the Ice Age Earth would absorb less solar radiation overall. Colder water is denser. Denser water sinks. The thermohaline circulation, the great conveyor belt of ocean water that moves heat and nutrients around the planet, would be more vigorous in some respects and less vigorous in others. The deep water formation in the North Atlantic, the process by which cold, salty surface water sinks to the bottom of the ocean, driving the circulation that eventually warms Western Europe in our own time, would be shifted southward, away from the ice margins. The overall pattern of ocean circulation in the permanent Ice Age would be different from today, though in ways that are complex and not fully certain. The chemical composition of the glacial ocean would also be different. Colder water holds more dissolved oxygen, which is good for marine life, but the lower sea level would mean that the shallow continental shelves, the most productive areas of the ocean, where sunlight can reach the bottom and where nutrients are abundant, would be reduced. The exposed shelves would be land, and the nutrients that currently wash off them into the ocean would instead be incorporated into the soils of the exposed land. The coastal fisheries of the permanent Ice Age ocean would be smaller in total area than those of the modern ocean, though potentially richer in terms of productivity per unit area, because the colder, more oxygenated waters would support dense populations of cold water fish. The great whale populations of the permanent Ice Age oceans would be supported by the rich, cold, nutrient upwelling zones that characterize glacial ocean circulation. The absence of modern industrial fishing, which would obviously not exist in a world without industrial civilization, would mean that these whale populations would be at or near the ecological carrying capacity of their habitats. The humpback whales and blue whales and sperm whales and right whales would all be present in numbers that dwarf anything we have seen in our own time, even in the most optimistic reconstructions of pre-whaling populations. The deep ocean of the permanent ice age would be cold and dark, as always, but its circulation might differ from what we know. In a world with a more vigorous thermohaline circulation, driven by the temperature gradients between the cold polar regions and the slightly warmer tropics, the deep ocean would be somewhat better oxygenated than in periods of weak circulation. This would support diverse communities of deep-sea organisms, the strange and largely unknown fauna of the abyssal plain, the ice shelves extending from the Antarctic continent and from the coastal regions of the Laurentide and Fennoscandian ice sheets, would calve icebergs into the ocean in enormous quantities. These icebergs, some of them kilometers across, surviving for years before they melt, would carry sediment and nutrients into the open ocean as they drift and melt. The areas of the ocean where the icebergs finally melt would receive pulses of fresh water and mineral nutrients, creating patches of enhanced productivity where phytoplankton would bloom and fish would gather. The coral reefs of the permanent ice age world would be present, but different from modern reefs. The cooler tropical temperatures would affect coral growth and distribution. The slightly lower sea level would expose some shallow reef platforms and inundate others. The reduced land area and the drier tropical climate would mean less terrestrial runoff, less sediment, and less nutrient pollution reaching the reefs, which might actually make them healthier in some respects than modern reefs, which suffer from agricultural runoff. The reefs of the permanent ice age world would be smaller in total extent than modern reefs, because the slightly cooler tropical temperatures would restrict the range of reef-building corals, but they would be in better chemical condition. The permafrost continent. In the permanent ice age, the permafrost, the perennially frozen ground that underlies the Arctic and subarctic regions, would be far more extensive than it is today. In our world, permafrost covers approximately 23% of the northern hemisphere land surface. In the permanent ice age, permafrost would extend much further south, underlying most of the periglacial zones south of the ice sheets. In North America, it would extend well south of the Great Lakes latitude. In Eurasia, it would cover most of Russia below the ice margin, most of Central Asia, and significant portions of northern China. The permafrost of the permanent ice age would be, in many places, extremely deep, hundreds of meters of frozen ground, accumulated over tens of thousands of years of continuous cold. This permafrost would be essentially a geological feature, as permanent as the bedrock beneath it, unlockable only by geological changes of the same magnitude that had created it. It would shape the landscape in profound ways. The rivers of the permafrost zone would be unusual. In the modern world, rivers can percolate into the ground. Their water seeps through the soil and into the groundwater table, slowly making its way through the earth before emerging elsewhere. In the permafrost zone of the permanent ice age, this percolation would be impossible because the ground below the thin active layer would be impermeable, frozen solid. The rivers would flow across the surface of the permafrost, unable to sink in. Their channels would be wide and shallow, constantly shifting as the permafrost heaved and subsided with the seasons. The landscapes they flowed through would be waterlogged, not because of rainfall, but because the water had nowhere to go. The permafrost would act as an impermeable surface beneath a thin, seasonally thawed skin of wet, boggy ground. This waterlogged terrain, the thermokarst landscape, would be extensive in the permanent Ice Age world. Shallow lakes and ponds, formed where the permafrost has thawed slightly and the surface has collapsed, would dot the landscape by the millions. These lakes would be cold and clear, fed by meltwater from the snow that collected on the tundra surface in winter and thawed briefly in summer. They would support fish, cold-adapted species of char and trout and pike and waterfowl. The permafrost of the permanent Ice Age would contain enormous quantities of frozen organic matter. Every summer, some plant material would accumulate on the tundra surface: grasses, sedges, mosses, and some of it would be incorporated into the permafrost as the ground froze again in autumn. Over 12,000 years of uninterrupted cold, this accumulation would be vast. The permafrost would be a frozen library of organic matter, a vast carbon store locked in ice, unavailable to the atmosphere. This locked carbon would mean that the atmosphere of the permanent Ice Age would have lower CO2 levels than the modern world, which would itself contribute to the cooling that maintained the ice. The Ice Age would, in a sense, sustain itself through this mechanism, the carbon it locked away in frozen soil, helping to maintain the cold conditions that kept the soil frozen. The Yodoma, a particular type of organic-rich permafrost found in Siberia, Alaska, and Yukon, would be far more extensive in the permanent Ice Age. This frozen organic material, sometimes called ice-rich loess, can contain up to 30 to 40% organic matter by weight, representing thousands of years of accumulated plant and animal remains. In the permanent Ice Age, the Yodoma would extend across enormous areas of northern Asia and North America, a frozen archive of Ice Age life, preserving in its depths the remains of mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses and horses and the plants they fed on. The landscapes immediately south of the ice sheets would be cold, flat, and dominated by the processes of periglacial geomorphology, the frost-driven processes that shape land in very cold environments. Frost polygons, geometric patterns, formed in the ground by repeated freezing and thawing, where ice wedges push soil into regular shapes, would cover vast areas. These polygons can be tens of meters across, and they give the landscape a strange, ordered appearance from above, as if the ground has been divided by invisible hands into regular geometric shapes. Pingos hills of frozen ground, with a core of ice, sometimes dozens of meters high, would dot the tundra landscape, formed when groundwater freezes and expands, pushing the soil upward. They look like rounded hills, rising incongruously from the flat tundra. They are a common feature of modern Arctic landscapes, and in the permanent Ice Age, they would be even more numerous, covering large areas of the periglacial zones, the refugia, islands of life in a sea of cold. Even in the permanent Ice Age world, even in the coldest, harshest conditions, there would be refugia places where the climate was slightly milder, slightly more sheltered, slightly more productive than the surrounding landscape, and where a greater variety of life could persist. Understanding the refugia of the permanent Ice Age is essential for understanding the biodiversity of that world. The most important refugia would be coastal. The ocean moderates climate. It absorbs heat in summer and releases it slowly in winter, preventing the most extreme temperature swings. Coastal regions, even in the coldest climates, tend to be milder than the interior of continents at the same latitude. In the permanent Ice Age, the coasts of the relatively warmer oceans, the North Atlantic, the North Pacific, the subtropical coasts of Africa and the Americas and southern Asia would be significantly milder than the cold continental interiors. Trees could grow in these coastal refugia that could not survive in the interior. A wider variety of plant species, and therefore a wider variety of animal species, could persist. The coasts of the British Isles, even with the ice sheets nearby, would have been relatively mild, moderated by the Gulf Stream, which, though shifted southward compared to today, would still carry warm Atlantic water northward along the European coast. In these coastal refugia, trees might survive, willows and birches, and possibly even oaks in the most sheltered locations. The flora of these refugia would be the seed bank for the forests that would eventually colonize the interior if, and this is the permanent ice age, so if is a large word, the ice ever retreated. The Iberian Peninsula and the Italian Peninsula, protected to the north by the mountains that separate them from the main European plain, would be refugia for temperate species. The forests of the Holocene might be tiny relict populations in the permanent ice age, surviving in the sheltered valleys and south-facing slopes of the Pyrenees and the Apennines, but surviving. Similarly, the Balkans and the Caucasus would be refugia for species that could not survive the open plains of the north. In North America, the refugia would be concentrated in the southern Appalachians, in the areas south of the Great Lakes that remained ice-free, and along the Pacific coast where the ocean moderated temperatures. The Olympic Peninsula of Washington State, the coast of Oregon, and Northern California would all be relatively mild, refugia in the shadow of the Cascade and Coast Ranges, sheltered from the cold continental air by the mountains. In Asia, the refugia would be concentrated in the relatively warm and moist lowlands of China, south of the Yellow River, in the valleys of Indochina, and in the still productive but drier forests of the Indian subcontinent. Japan, moderated by the warm Kuroshio current, would be a significant refugium for temperate East Asian species. The tropical refugia would be the most important for biodiversity. The Amazon rainforest, reduced to perhaps a third of its modern extent, he would survive in fragments along the major rivers and in the areas where orographic rainfall produced when moist air is forced upward over mountains, could maintain moisture year-round. The Congo Basin would have similar fragmented forest refugia. These tropical refugia would be the genetic reservoirs for the enormous biodiversity of the tropical forests, maintaining millions of species through the cold millennia, waiting for a warmth that, in the permanent ice age, would never fully come. The species that survived in the refugia would be under intense selection pressure. They would be surrounded by unsuitable habitat, unable to expand their ranges, with their populations small enough to experience significant genetic drift. Some would go extinct, unable to maintain viable populations in their restricted refugia. Others would diversify, evolving different adaptations in different refugia, so that after thousands of years of isolation, the populations in different refugia would become genetically distinct and perhaps eventually separate species. The permanent ice age might produce more speciation in the refugia than our warming world has seen, as populations became increasingly isolated by the surrounding cold. The sky above the ice. The sky of the permanent ice age world would be one of the most immediately strange and beautiful things about that world for any observer who was sensitive to the light. Over the ice sheets themselves, the sky would often be a deep, cold blue, deeper and more saturated than the blue of the modern sky, because the ice-covered surface reflects sunlight back upward into the atmosphere, brightening the sky from below. Above the ice, the air would be extraordinarily clear, Cold air holds very little water vapor, and the ice sheets produced almost no particulate matter to scatter the light. The sun, on a clear day over the ice, would appear sharper and more intense than the sun of our world, its edges crisp against the cold blue sky, its light blindingly white where it reflected off the snow surface. The aurora borealis, the northern lights, would be spectacular over the permanent ice age world. The auroras are produced when charged particles from the sun interact with the Earth's magnetic field and with the upper atmosphere, producing the dancing curtains of light that illuminate Arctic nights. They are not directly affected by the state of the ice sheets, but they would be more easily visible in the permanent ice age world than in our own, because the light pollution of our cities would not exist. Every dark night, in the high latitude regions of the permanent ice age, the northern lights would paint the sky in green and purple and red over the white expanse of the ice sheets, over the frozen tundra, over the sea ice of the Arctic Ocean. The midnight sun and the polar night would be more dramatically experienced in the permanent ice age world than in our own. Without cities and their artificial light, the long Arctic winters, with their months of near total darkness, would be genuinely dark in a way that is almost impossible to imagine in the modern world. The darkness would be profound and complete, broken only by the stars and the moon and the aurora. The animals and the humans of the permanent ice age would have evolved cultural and behavioral adaptations to this darkness that we, with our artificial light, have largely forgotten we ever needed. The stars over the permanent ice age would be extraordinary. Without light pollution, without the haze of agricultural burning and industrial smoke that colors our modern skies, the stars would be visible in their full glory. The Milky Way, a tangible presence overhead on moonless nights, not a faint suggestion at the edge of vision, but a river of light, so bright and so structured that individual clouds of stars would be visible to the naked eye. The humans of the permanent ice age would know the stars with an intimacy that most modern people have lost. They would navigate by them, tell stories by them, time their movements to them. The clouds over the ice age world would be different from modern clouds. The cold air would produce less convective cloud. The towering cumulonimbus of tropical thunderstorms would be rare or absent at high latitudes. Instead, the dominant clouds would be the stratiform clouds, the flat, layered sheets of cloud that form when moist air is slowly lifted and cooled, and the lenticular clouds that form over the mountains when wind is deflected upward. The ice sheets would generate their own weather systems. Katabatic winds, cold, dense air flowing outward from the high ice surface, would create strong and persistent winds at the margins of the ice, and the meeting of this cold air with the warmer air of the southern steppes would generate fierce storms along the ice margins. The dust storms of the permanent ice age would be another dramatic feature of its sky. The cold, dry winds of the glacial world would pick up fine particles of rock, flour, material ground to a fine powder by the glaciers and carry it hundreds or even thousands of kilometers before depositing it as loess, the fine, silty sediment that covers large areas of China, Europe, and North America as a testament to ice age winds. These dust storms, visible from space as brown clouds moving across the landscape, would be a regular feature of the permanent ice age sky, particularly in spring and autumn, when the katabatic winds were strongest and the ground surface was most exposed. What would have died in the permanent ice age? Some things that exist in our world would not exist. Some of them would be familiar things, things we rely on and take for granted, things whose absence from the permanent Ice Age world illuminates how much the warmth of the Holocene has given us. The tropical rainforests, as we have noted, would be dramatically reduced. But it is worth dwelling on what this means in terms of biodiversity. The tropical rainforests are the most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth. They contain, depending on which estimates you trust, between 50 and 80% of all the species on the planet in only about 6% of the land area. This extraordinary concentration of species is the product of millions of years of evolution in stable, warm, moist conditions, exactly the conditions that the permanent Ice Age would deny them. In the permanent Ice Age, the rainforests would be reduced to small refugia. The species they contained would be either extinct or surviving in tiny, isolated populations. The biodiversity of the permanent Ice Age world would be a shadow of what we know in the modern tropics. The coral reefs, slightly reduced in extent by the cooler temperatures and the lower sea level, would also be less diverse. Coral reef biodiversity is extraordinary. Reefs cover less than 1% of the ocean floor, but are home to perhaps 25% of all marine species. This biodiversity is also the product of millions of years of evolution in warm, shallow, clear water, and the permanent Ice Age's cooler temperatures and altered ocean chemistry would reduce it, though not eliminate it. Many of the plants that support modern human civilization would not exist in the permanent Ice Age, or would not have been domesticated, since domestication requires the settled agricultural societies that the Ice Age climate would prevent. Wheat, barley, rice, maize, soybeans, cotton, sugarcane, rubber, coffee, cacao, all the agricultural and industrial plants that have shaped human history would either not exist in their cultivated forms, or would exist only as wild ancestors in small populations in the warmer refugia. The diseases of civilization, the infectious diseases that jumped from domesticated animals to humans as agriculture developed and population densities rose, would also largely not exist. Measles, smallpox, influenza, tuberculosis, cholera, bubonic plague, all the great epidemic diseases of human history were associated with the dense populations and close human-animal contact of agricultural societies. In the permanent Ice Age world, with its small, nomadic human bands, these diseases could not maintain themselves. A disease that spreads by person-to-person contact requires a certain minimum population density to sustain itself in populations too small and too dispersed. An epidemic simply burns through the local group and then runs out of new hosts. The humans of the permanent Ice Age would have their own diseases, but the great plagues of civilization would not be among them. Many of the insects of the modern world, the bees and butterflies and other pollinators that depend on the flowering plants of warm environments, would be dramatically reduced in the permanent Ice Age. This would be a consequence of the reduction in flowering plant diversity and abundance, which would itself be a consequence of the colder, drier climate. The flowers that depend on these insects for pollination would also be reduced. The co-evolutionary relationship between flowering plants and their pollinators, one of the most productive partnerships in the history of life, would be weakened and reduced. What would have thrived? But for every loss in the permanent Ice Age world, there would be a corresponding flourishing, something that, in the cold and the ice and the open landscapes, would find its ideal conditions and expand far beyond its current modest range. The cold-adapted conifers, the spruces and firs and pines and larches that today form the boreal forest would extend as far south as their preferred cold climate allowed, which in the permanent ice age might be very far south indeed. These trees, which today stop at a certain latitude because the climate south of that line is too warm for them, would have no such constraint in the permanent ice age. They would grow wherever the combination of sufficient summer warmth and sufficient moisture allowed, which might include areas of the northern United States, northern Europe, south of the ice margin, and northern Asia. The cold water fisheries of the permanent ice age oceans would be extraordinarily productive. Cold water holds more oxygen, sustains more phytoplankton, and supports greater densities of fish than warm water. The North Atlantic and North Pacific, cooled by the proximity of the ice sheets and by the altered circulation, would be teeming with cod and herring and capelin and the other cold water fish that dominated the pre-industrial ocean. These fisheries, unexploited by industrial fishing, would be as rich as the legendary fisheries of the medieval North Atlantic that the Basques and Norse exploited before European industrialization. The moss and lichen ecosystems of the tundra would be far more extensive in the permanent ice age than they are today. Mosses and lichens are the defining plants of the Arctic, slow-growing, cold-tolerant, capable of photosynthesizing at temperatures near freezing, able to dry out and revive without permanent damage. In the expanded tundra of the permanent ice age, mosses and lichens would cover an area much larger than they do today, forming a continuous green-brown carpet across the ice margin landscapes. They would be the food of lemmings and caribou and musk oxen, and the lemmings and caribou and musk oxen would be the food of foxes and wolves and snowy owls. The migratory birds of the permanent ice age would be extraordinary. The Arctic tundra, in summer, is one of the most productive bird habitats on Earth. The long days, the abundant insects emerging from the thawed active layer, the shallow ponds full of invertebrates provide ideal conditions for nesting birds, and millions of birds migrate northward each year to take advantage of this brief bonanza. In the permanent ice age, with a larger tundra, the summer breeding grounds for migratory birds would be more extensive, supporting larger populations. The birds that take advantage of the Arctic summer, the shorebirds and ducks and geese and terns, would be far more numerous than they are today. The cold-adapted marine mammals would thrive. Walruses, seals, polar bears, beluga whales, narwhals, bowhead whales, all the specialists of the cold Arctic Ocean would have a far larger habitat in the permanent ice age than they do today. The sea ice that they depend on would be more extensive and more persistent, and the cold, productive waters beneath it would support the fish and invertebrates that sustain them. Walrus populations, in particular, which today number in the hundreds of thousands, might number in the tens of millions in the permanent ice age, hauling out on the vast exposed coastal shelves in herds that would be almost incomprehensible by modern standards. The grasslands and steppes of the permanent ice age, though cold and wind-blasted, would sustain remarkable densities of grazing animals. The mammoth steppe, the ecosystem that characterized the periglacial zone during the last glacial maximum, was more productive than its cold and dry conditions might suggest. The short, tough grasses and sedges of the steppe, though individually less productive than the tall grasses of a temperate prairie, covered an enormous area, and the animals that grazed them were correspondingly abundant. The horses and bison and reindeer and musk, oxen and mammoths of the permanent Ice Age steppe would be present in numbers that would astonish a modern observer. The cities that would never have been built. Let us imagine, for a moment, the specific places in our world that would not exist in the world of the permanent Ice Age, not as an exercise in mourning, but as a way of understanding what the Holocene warming made possible. London would not exist. The Thames Valley today, one of the most productive agricultural areas of Britain, would be cold, periglacial tundra in the shadow of the ice sheet that would cover Scotland and northern England. The site of what is today London would be a flat, wind-swept plain of frozen ground and gravel, the Thames a braided, gray river carrying glacial meltwater southward. No city would be built there. No one would want to live there who had any choice. Paris would not exist. The Seine Valley, like the Thames Valley, would be cold and largely treeless, periglacial steppe, perhaps, or open tundra. The fertile agricultural plains of northern France that made Paris a great city would be frozen. The mild, productive climate of the Loire Valley, the vineyards of Bordeaux, the wheat fields of the Beauce Plain, all of these would be absent in the permanent Ice Age. The agricultural productivity that allowed France to become the most populous and powerful country in medieval Europe would not exist. Moscow would be under several kilometers of ice. The site of Moscow, at approximately 56 degrees north latitude, was covered by the Fennoscandian ice sheet at the last glacial maximum, and in the permanent Ice Age, it would remain so. The vast Russian plain today, one of the world's great agricultural regions, producing enormous quantities of wheat and sunflowers and sugar beets, would be a frozen, largely uninhabitable wasteland. Not ice, necessarily, but cold steppe and tundra, swept by bitter winds from the ice sheets to the north and west. New York would not exist. The site of Manhattan was covered by the Laurentide ice sheet at the last glacial maximum. The glaciers that retreated from Manhattan left behind the distinctive rocky ridgelines and the erratic boulders that are visible in Central Park today. In the permanent Ice Age, these glaciers would remain. The Hudson River Valley, today one of the most beautiful and productive regions of the northeastern United States, would be buried under ice. Beijing, at 40 degrees north latitude, would probably not be under ice, but it would be in the cold, dry, periglacial zone to the south of the ice sheet that would cover northern China and Siberia. The North China Plain, the agricultural heartland of China, the region that has fed more human beings than any comparable area on Earth, would be cold, dry steppe, unsuitable for the intensive agriculture that made Chinese civilization possible. Without the North China Plain, there would be no Chinese civilization as we know it. Cairo would not exist, not because the site is too cold, but because the agricultural productivity of the Nile Valley, which made Egypt one of the wealthiest and most powerful civilizations of the ancient world, would be diminished in the permanent Ice Age. The Nile's flood, which deposited the rich black silt that made the Nile Valley so extraordinarily fertile, would be altered by the changed climate of the Ethiopian highlands, where the Nile's headwaters rise. The monsoon rainfall that feeds the Blue Nile would be weaker, the floods less predictable, the deposited silt less generous. And without the Nile flood, there is no pharaonic Egypt. The cities of the Fertile Crescent, the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, where agriculture was first developed and the first writing was invented, would not exist. The Fertile Crescent itself would not be fertile in the permanent Ice Age. The warm, moist conditions that allowed the wild ancestors of wheat and barley to spread across the Levant and allowed the first farmers to domesticate them would not exist. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates, instead of being a rich agricultural plain, would be cold and dry in the winter, hot and dry in the summer, unsuitable for the kind of productive agriculture that supported Sumerian and Babylonian civilization. Los Angeles would exist in some form. The climate of Southern California, moderated by the Pacific, would be milder than most of the northern latitudes, but it would not be the city we know. The Central Valley of California, which today produces enormous quantities of food for the entire world, would be cold and largely treeless, its productive soils locked under permafrost in the colder phases and waterlogged and boggy in the warmer phases. The city that might eventually grow at the site of Los Angeles would be a small, coastal settlement, exploiting the productivity of the cold Pacific fisheries, not the agricultural hinterland. The places that would thrive in the permanent ice age would be different from the great cities of our world. The coasts of the relatively warmer oceans would support larger settlements than the continental interiors. The south-facing slopes of mountain ranges, sheltered from the cold winds and receiving maximum sunlight, would be more productive than the flat plains. The river valleys of the warmer subtropical regions, southern China, the Indus Valley, the coasts of West Africa, would be among the most hospitable environments for human settlement. A walk across the frozen world. Let us take a walk, a slow, patient, dreamlike walk across the permanent ice age world, from somewhere cold to somewhere slightly less cold, to feel the texture of that world under our feet and against our skin. We begin on the coast of what is today northern France, on a gray afternoon in what would be mid-June, the warmest month of the year in this region. The sky is overcast, a uniform pale gray, the kind of sky that has no drama, no cloud formations, only a flat diffusion of cold light from somewhere above the overcast. The wind is from the north, as it usually is in this part of the world, a steady, cold wind that smells of ice and distance, that carries with it the faint metallic smell of glacial rock flour picked up somewhere over the ice sheet and carried south. Beneath our feet, the ground is tundra, a thin, boggy, active layer over permafrost. The soil is dark and waterlogged, pocked with shallow pools of water that have nowhere to drain. The plants are low and prostrate, sedges and cotton grass, their white, fluffy seed heads nodding in the wind. Patches of moss, brilliant green where they are wet, olive brown where they have dried slightly, dwarf willows, barely 10 centimeters tall, their roots adapted to the shallow, active layer above the frozen ground. There are flowers, small ones, low to the ground, purple and yellow and white, the flowers of plants that have adapted their entire life cycle to the brief Arctic summer. They are beautiful in a miniature, determined way. To the north, visible on clear days, though today it is hidden in cloud, is the ice sheet. It begins perhaps 100 kilometers north of here. Its margin, a cliff of dirty ice, 20 to 30 meters high, streaked with dark bands of glacial debris. It extends northward and northward to the horizon and beyond that horizon, and beyond the next horizon for 1,000 kilometers and more, to where it merges with the ice of Scandinavia and becomes part of the great ice complex that covers northern Europe. To the south, the tundra gives way gradually, over the course of many kilometers, to something slightly different: cold steppe, less boggy, with more grass and fewer sedges, more exposed mineral soil, where the wind has blown the snow away in winter. In the distance, barely visible through the overcast, the dark shapes of a herd of animals. Reindeer, perhaps, or horses, both are common on this steppe. moving slowly, grazing, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. We walk south. The ground firms slightly as the permafrost deepens and the active layer thins. The plants become more diverse, more species of grass, taller plants, where the terrain is slightly sheltered from the wind, the first hints of shrub, willow, and dwarf birch in the valley of a small stream, ptarmigan white-feathered, nearly invisible against the patches of snow that persist in the north-facing hollows, burst from the vegetation at our approach and glide away on curved wings, their calls a harsh, scolding rattle. The stream we are following runs clear and cold, its water the pale blue-gray of glacial meltwater. Fish move in the deeper pools, Arctic char, their bodies silver and spotted, resting in the current. On a flat rock at the stream's edge, an otter has left the remains of its meal, the head of a fish, neatly consumed to the spine, the vertebrae visible and white. The otter itself is gone, somewhere upstream or down. We continue south for a day, for 2 days. The tundra gradually transitions to something slightly warmer. The willows and dwarf birches grow taller, knee-high, then waist-high, then head-high. The first proper trees appear in the most sheltered valleys. A few spruces, short and wind-bent, their lower branches killed by the weight of accumulated snow, but their tops reaching for the gray sky. Their presence means we are in a refugium, a place where the climate is slightly milder than the surrounding landscape, where trees have survived the ice age by finding shelter in the terrain. The spruces become more numerous, then more dense, until we are walking through something that, in dim light, you might call a forest, though it is nothing like the tall, dark, cathedral boreal forest of the modern world. It is open and scrubby, the trees never more than 10 meters tall, widely spaced, the floor between them covered in moss and lichen and berry-bearing dwarf shrubs. The berries, crowberries, bearberries, cloudberries are just ripening, their brief season of sugar and color the most extravagant thing in this spare landscape. In this sparse forest, there is more life than in the open tundra. A red squirrel crosses a branch above us. A flock of crossbills, birds adapted to extracting seeds from conifer cones, moves through the trees, their bills twisted and crossed, working at the cones with practiced efficiency. A wolverine materializes briefly at the edge of a clearing, looks at us with its amber eyes, and disappears into the trees without hurry. The sky clears late in the afternoon. The sun still above the horizon, because this is midsummer and we are at a high latitude, casts a low, golden light that turns the tundra copper and the ice on the distant peaks rose pink. The shadows are long and purple. The air smells of cold and moss and the faint sweetness of the berry shrubs. A wolf howls somewhere to the east, a long, carrying sound that travels far in the cold air, and then silence. We camp in the shelter of a spruce grove beside the stream. The stream mutters over the stones. The stars come out, many more of them than any modern city dweller has ever seen, and the Milky Way arches overhead, a pale river of light. To the north, the sky begins to glow, faint at first, then stronger, the aurora borealis spreading in curtains of green and white across the northern sky, reflected in the still water of a pool beside the stream. This is the permanent Ice Age world, cold, spare, beautiful in its austerity, inhabited by a diversity of life that has learned, over thousands of generations, to find abundance in scarcity. Not the lush, complex, heat-soaked world we know, but a world, a full world, in its own way, a world that was almost ours. Epilogue. The gift of the melt. The Ice Age ended. In our world, it ended. And because it ended, every everything that followed was possible. Lying here, in the warmth, in the dark, it is worth spending a moment thinking about what that ending gave us. Not abstractly, not in terms of civilizations and cities and agriculture, though all of those are gifts of the warming, but personally, concretely, in terms of the specific, immediate experience of being alive in the world that the Holocene created. The tree outside your window, if there is a tree outside your window, would not be there in the permanent Ice Age world. Not there, or not there in the form you know it. Tall, leafy, providing shade in summer and the bare drama of branches against the winter sky. Trees of that kind require the Holocene. They require the warmth and moisture and stable climate that the retreat of the ice made possible. The food you ate today, if it included bread or rice or any grain product, if it included fruit or vegetables grown in fields, if it included meat from domesticated animals, came from the agricultural revolution that the Holocene made possible. None of it would exist in the permanent Ice Age. The wheat, the rice, the corn, the soybean, all of these are Holocene inventions, products of the 10,000 years of warm, stable climate during which human beings discovered agriculture and built civilizations on its foundation. The language you speak, if your language is English, or French, or Chinese, or Hindi, or Arabic, or any of the thousands of languages that have developed over the last 10,000 years as human populations grew and differentiated and interacted, is a Holocene invention. The language would not exist in the permanent Ice Age because the populations that developed it would not exist. The migrations and interactions and cultural exchanges that shaped it would not have happened. The historical events that influenced it would not have occurred. The world you were born into is not the default world. It is not the inevitable world. It is the specific world that resulted from a particular set of geological and astronomical coincidences that caused the ice to retreat 12,000 years ago. It is a world that almost wasn't, a world that, by the narrow margin of an orbital wobble, came into being rather than remaining frozen. This is not a reason for complacency about the changes we are making to our climate, quite the opposite. It is a reminder of how finely balanced the conditions for the world we know actually are. The warmth that created the Holocene was the result of small changes in the Earth's orbital geometry, amplified by feedback loops in the climate system. The changes we are making to the atmosphere are large by any geological standard, and they will have consequences that we are only beginning to understand. But tonight, that is not the point. Tonight, the point is simpler. Tonight, the point is the warmth of the room and the weight of the blanket and the way the darkness outside is the darkness of a temperate night rather than the darkness of an Arctic one. Tonight, the point is the 12,000 years of warming that gave us everything, the forests and the fields and the cities and the languages and the art and the science and the 10,000 years of human history that led to you lying here, breathing slowly on the edge of sleep. The ice would have stayed. In a slightly different universe, in a world with a different orbital geometry, or a different atmospheric composition, or a different arrangement of the continents, the ice would have stayed. And in that world, the ground beneath your house would be permafrost, or tundra, or the bare rock of a glaciated landscape. And you would not be here, but the ice melted. The ice melted, and the seas rose, and the forests returned, and the grasses spread, and the animals moved, and the climate stabilized, and the soil deepened, and the plants diversified. And eventually, very recently, in geological time, the first farmers planted the first seeds in the first fields, and civilization began. The gift of the melt is everything. It is the ground beneath you. It is the air around you. It is the food in your body. It is the warmth in the room. You are a child of the thaw, an inheritor of the warmth that ended the ice age. Everything about your world, everything about your life is possible because the ice retreated and left behind a planet gentle enough to feed you and warm enough to clothe you and stable enough to shelter you. Rest in that. Let the warmth be the thing you notice last before you sleep. The warmth of the room, the warmth of the air, the warmth of the body that carries you through the world. Let it be a comfort, the way the most true and most ancient comforts always are. Not earned, not guaranteed, but received, given, present, tonight, in this room, in this darkness, on this improbably warm and living planet. The ice never came back, and because it didn't, you are here. Sleep well. Good night.